Good afternoon, Nigel Vaz. It's great to get some more time with you. Let's just get straight to the point here. Are you excited? Are you enthusiastic or nervously anxious about AI? What's your general feeling on everything after reflecting on the last year and beyond?
Look, I'd say on balance, I'm definitely excited and enthusiastic, but there's definitely a measure of anxiousness, specifically because I think that the potential of AI to really be a transformative force in the same way that we saw the internet and then, the wave that came after with mobile and social to really make a difference in our lives is huge. But at the same time, like we saw with social media in particular, there were lots of things that we didn't get right so significantly that then caused a decade of almost now thinking about how to rework it, right? So the excitement comes from the potential of businesses really having a transformational impact to what it is that they're trying to do. And then the anxiousness comes from how do they do that in a way that is actually thoughtful about the risks and the downsides of this in the context of how it's actually going to play out for their organizations.
You could talk to anyone under the age of 25, they're using ChatGPT for everything from food recipes to helping them with their studies, right? But
yeah,
how's this gonna drive value for enterprises, right? Why is this different? How's this going to drive a value proposition for enterprises in the future?
I mean, for me, it's a very simple idea, right? AI has always been a part of our lives now for the last few years, but the fundamental shift for me is how it went from being predictive, which is fundamentally, allowing you to ascertain potential outcomes based on data, to creation, right? And I think that was a significant step simply because I think the combination of those two things now, where you can have the same predictive power that existed, but you now also have a capability which thrives where human creativity does, and a combination of those things means you have decision making and creativity, sitting together, atop all of the advances that are already been made around machine learning algorithms and what have you. I think whether you think about growth functions or you think about efficiency functions, now you have a capability that has the potential to dramatically affect both of those, right? From business efficiencies to how do you create new products, services, experiences. And it just allows organizations to just be far more creative in functions that they were not able to do that in a pretty significant way.
So what would you expect to see by kind of beginning of next year versus maybe a year or two beyond that in terms of development?
Right now, I think we're seeing a lot of experimentation in organizations to understand the potential of what this means for them. And I think you're going to start to see that experimentation in content generation and software development and language translation and data augmentation and chatbots and conversational AI, but you're also starting to see it in product design. And all of these things, I think we'll start to see some scale in, right? Where, for example, in product design now, engineers and designers are creating optimized models, which move to prototypes much faster.
We look at the shift in mindset from maybe a developer mindset to a probabilistic mindset. But how fast do you think this reskilling needs to happen? And how is it happening in your business?
Look, I think for us, right, reskilling, I often talk about, I think when we spoke previously, this idea that we have to constantly learn, unlearn, and relearn, right? And this is one of those incredible moments in time where there's a fair bit of unlearning that has to happen. Because what you are going to see is you're going to see a developer who says, hey, I can write incredible code because I've been doing it for 5 or 6 years. And somebody else who adopts, these new tools and technologies, which allow them to catch up to that level of competence much, much sooner. It's a state of mind as opposed to a moment in time idea. So from essentially being somebody that's prided on the knowledge that you have to become prided on essentially being able to learn that knowledge. So almost like from a know-it-all to a learn-it-all kind of notion.
So, we talk about this mindset. What do you think an enterprise leader should be doing now to prepare in these types of areas of training and strategy alignment? I mean, I love what you're saying about unlearning and relearning. How can you then get a workforce to embrace that mindset? Because clients like it easy, enterprises like easy, they don't like hard, and people think this is hard. So what do you think is the steps that they can take to really make this shift?
I think for me, it's really important, right, to recognize that this idea of digital business transformation or business transformation in the digital world that we talk about, right, is now more than ever not about just implementing a new technology. So if you think about AI and say, hey, there's a new thing we need to embrace, it's another new technology in the same way that we have before, I think the possibilities of the transformation get limited by not having that longer term strategic vision of reimagining your business in the context of that. So to me, in an organization, it's got to start with a house, right? You got to start with that North Star, kind of vision of what it is that your company could be tomorrow, because that real introspection will allow you to embrace the transformation in a way that helps you rethink things as opposed to simply just extend whatever it is that you're doing today. So it's kind of like we've defined the vision, we've created a set of tools to allow people to experiment. Now we're going to prioritize X area, and that's where we're going to make a concerted push to begin the journey of really reimagining this area of our business or that area of our business. And then you start to create that iteration, which I think doesn't necessarily end. I don't think you have a neat beginning and an end. It's a constant evolution.
What do you think is really important when you're talking to your clients about ethical considerations impacting businesses, particularly around these GenAI developments?
We think about this as a kind of framework that says, how do you think about data privacy and security, which are the underlying building blocks that are core to any business, function, right? So how do you ensure that they're handling data responsibly, protecting it from unauthorized access, complying with whether it's GDPR, in Europe, and some parts of some companies in the US who have adopted the standards, or things like HIPAA, if you're dealing with the healthcare space, right? Then I think you've got a really big area around bias and fairness. So starting to really think about understanding the fact that inherently the training data that you use to train models have to be addressed in the context of bias and ensuring AI systems are fair and unbiased, because particularly when you're thinking about things like hiring people in your organization, or if you're a bank and you're thinking about lending, or, we do some work for the LA Public Defender's Office and you're thinking about criminal justice. In any of these cases, the implications of that bias is huge, right? I mean, you have very different outcomes. So how do you ensure that the training data is great? And then the last thing is, the transparency, right? So some of the black box nature of how these systems operate can make it challenging to understand how they're actually thinking about their decision-making process. So ensuring that you understand what the transparency in the models are, how you account for accountability and regulatory compliance. And the reality is, when you think about so many of these, it's a technological solution in many cases, because you have to understand, for example, how you are reinforcing that learning.
So thinking through our industry, and let's think about maybe professional services and value-added partnerships with enterprise.
Sure.
How do you think we're going to be impacted by all this? And do you think the current crop can change their mindsets, products, and delivery to get ahead of this? Or
I mean, look, I think there's huge opportunity, right? Because I think if you imagine that every single company around the planet now has to fundamentally lift themselves up to an operating model that requires fluidity. And, when we typically at Sapient talk about our speed capabilities in the context of transformation, so strategy, product, experience, engineering, data, and AI. When you think about now AI creating a beacon of focus for companies needing to transform, what it forces you to do is get really clear-headed about what is the strategy in what value are you trying to unlock? How do you move from this, project by project approach to a product mindset where you're constantly evolving? How do you think about the experience of the employee, and how do you think about the experience of the customer? How do you think about engineering, not just about cost and about risk, but how do you think about it in the context of value and differentiation? And ultimately, how do you think about data as the fuel and the intelligence behind AI, in the context of how it's making decisions, and think about engineering around data and strategy around data in the same way that you think about the transformation you're trying to drive in your organization, right? If you think about all of those things in a professional services context, those capabilities, for example, in our organization are intrinsic to how we work. And every one of those is going through a massive evolution, both in the ways we can ourselves transform ourselves in order to help our clients transform, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity to basically say, if you don't embrace this way of doing things, you're not going to be able to help your clients embody the kind of transformation they need to embody.
So I got one final question for you. Try and look forward 2 years. What do you think we'll be talking about? What will enterprise tech be like? Looking at maybe what's happened over the last 12 months, even the last 6 months. Look ahead.
Yeah, it's super hard to predict. Obviously, as and we're all in the business of, to some extent, having to have a point of view, right? My belief is over the next few years, what we're seeing is this idea of a platform effect playing out, right? So we've already seen things like 5G and cloud and big data act as one layer of the platform. We are building on the internet and mobility, right? The next layer of the platform that we've seen evolve now is the current wave of generative AI that we are, experiencing today, right? But if I were to forecast how this has to play out in the future, I think the third wave that has to come to further AI and really bring it to its true potential, right, has got to do with things like computing power. So quantum as an example, right? I mean, if you just look at the new Sycamore processor, the 70 qubits Google processor around quantum, and the rate at which it's improved its previous demonstration of quantum computing in 2019, it's just significant, something that would take 47 years done in 6 seconds. So to me, what this new world of AI needs is a combination of huge amounts of computing power that allow us to process and train models significantly faster, but also then allow us to apply these to much bigger problems like environmental security, food security, understanding how we can actually, really make decisions at a kind of more planetary level, right? So you've got that kind of wave. The next, from an enterprise perspective, I think, if you've got computing, I think there's definitely going to be a huge focus on interactivity. Like you and I sitting here today, in a Zoom, feels significantly more progressed than a phone call or a conference call that would have happened 10 years ago. But I think the next level of this has got to be, when I see my 13-year-old interactively gaming with friends, the immersiveness of where the technology is today is really limited by processing power and by interactive technology. So I feel like the immersiveness of experiences and how you can engage is going to be significantly uplifted, right? And we've had lots of conversations about metaverse and, virtual and physical and real. And to me, it's sort of like, how do you create this hyper real augmented environment where you're virtual in some instances, but you're just augmenting reality in others, right? And I think you start to see that, with the very early signs and things like Google Maps, and the evolution that Maps is going through with the, putting you into context with the world around you, right? That's, I think, the second kind of block alongside computing is kind of interactivity in general, and immersiveness in general. And then I think the third piece for me is robotics and automation. So there are still probably too many things that we are limited from doing, not because of the not because of basically the digital technological limitations, but the physical technological limitations. I remember talking to one of the MIT robotics scientists a few years ago, and he said, one of the hardest things for us to figure out how to do from a robotics perspective, and this is of course a few years ago now, is essentially replace the opposable thumb of a person, in a hand, like what you can do, which is just the thumb opposing a finger to lift and pick something up, right? And it's incredibly hard to get a robot to do that with the same level of precision. And so to me, like the space of automation has been big in a digital context. We've automated a lot of digital things, but I think the combination of robotics and automation could really start to unveil the physical world that we live in. So if you think about, huge amounts of computing power enabling all kinds of really sophisticated AI, really immersive, interactive environments that you can move between physical and digital in a seamless fashion. And then robots essentially that exist in a physical context, driving the same kind of automation that we've seen from a digital perspective, I think is probably a really powerful kind of, 1, 2, 3 kind of punch.
That's fantastic. This has been phenomenal. Phenomenal, Nigel. Really enjoyed the futuristic insights in particular.
Thanks, Phil. It was great to see you again.